The wind in the San Luis Valley had a voice, and in late autumn of 1879, it spoke of nothing but hardship. It was a dry, scouring sound that swept down from the snow-dusted peaks of the Sangre de Cristo Range, carrying the grit of the high plains and the promise of a long, cold winter. It rattled the single pane of glass in the window of the Highline Saloon and sent dust devils dancing down the main street of Esperanza, a town that consisted of little more than the saloon, a general store, a smithy whose hammer rang with metronomic certainty, and a modest structure that served as both post office and, on Sundays, a church. Jack Calloway felt the wind in his bones. At 35, he was a man shaped by this land, lean, weathered, with eyes the color of a faded blue sky that held more distance than warmth. He sat alone at a corner table, a mug of lukewarm coffee untouched before him. His gaze fixed on the empty road. He was waiting for the afternoon stage, and waiting for a stranger who had agreed, through a series of letters penned in a surprisingly elegant hand, to become his wife. The idea had been born of desperation, not romance. The past year had stripped Jack bare. A flash flood had torn through his lower pasture, taking a dozen head of prime cattle and the bridge connecting his ranch to the main road. Before he could even begin to rebuild, a wave of lung fever had swept through his remaining herd, silent and swift. It was the same sickness that had taken his wife, Martha, 2 winters prior, leaving a silence in his small ranch house that was louder than any storm. The Calloway Ranch was failing, and Jack knew he couldn't save it alone. So he'd placed the advertisement in an eastern newspaper, the words feeling foreign and shameful as he wrote them. Widowed rancher seeks a wife, honest, hard-working, a partner to build a life in the Colorado Territory. It was a practical plea, a business arrangement couched in the language of matrimony. He needed hands to help, a mind to plan, a presence to ward off the crushing loneliness that threatened to swallow him whole. The response from a Miss Nora Hart of Kansas had been different from the others. It was brief, direct, and devoid of the flowery prose or hopeful desperation that marked the rest. Her handwriting was clean and steady. She asked practical questions about the water source, the severity of the winters, the nature of the work. She made no mention of love or companionship. She enclosed no photograph. She simply stated that she was 24, healthy, and accustomed to labor. She would arrive on the last stage of October. The townsfolk of Esperanza watched Jack from the corners of their eyes. They knew his story, had offered clumsy condolences and platters of food after Martha's passing, and had watched with a mixture of pity and respect as he'd fought to keep his head above water. Now, their curiosity was a palpable thing, a mail-order bride. It was a common enough arrangement on the frontier, but for a man as private as Jack Calloway, it felt like a public declaration of failure. The distant rumble and creak of the stagecoach finally broke the afternoon's monotony. Jack stood, his joints stiff, and dropped a coin on the table. He stepped out onto the boardwalk, pulling the brim of his hat low against the relentless wind. The coach, caked in dust and looking weary, swayed to a halt in front of the post office. A few passengers disembarked a drummer with a worn sample case, a young family heading further west. Then she appeared. She was the last one out, and she did not match the woman Jack had constructed in his mind. He'd expected someone either plain and hardened by farm life or soft and ill-suited to the grit of the territory. Nora Hart was neither. She was of average height, with a posture that was perfectly straight, almost rigid. Her dress was a simple, dark wool, practical and unadorned, and a heavy cloak was drawn tightly around her shoulders despite the sun. Her face, framed by dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, was calm, her expression unreadable. But it was her eyes that held him. They were a startling shade of blue-gray, the color of ash after a fire has died, and they met his gaze directly, without hesitation or coquetry. They were the eyes of someone who saw things, all things, and judged them quietly. She carried a single, Small valise. Nothing else. Mr. Calloway. Her voice was low and steady, with no discernible accent. Ma'am? Jack nodded, touching the brim of his hat. He took the valise from her. It was surprisingly light. Nora Hart. I am. The whispers started immediately. A low hum from the women clustered near the general store, and the men loafing on the saloon porch. Jack felt their stares like a physical weight. He ignored them, leading her toward his buckboard wagon parked by the smithy. He loaded her valise in the back and offered a hand to help her up. She looked at his offered hand for a fraction of a second, a flicker of something unreadable in her ash-blue eyes, before climbing up unassisted, her movements fluid and sure. The ride to the Rancho Calloway was conducted in a near-complete silence, broken only by the creak of the wagon wheels and the sigh of the wind. Jack pointed out landmarks with clipped, factual statements. That's the Ute Peak. Snow stays on it till June. The river forks up ahead. My land starts at the Cottonwoods. He wasn't trying to make conversation. He was giving her the lay of the land, a map for survival. Nora said nothing, but he could feel her watching everything. Her gaze swept over the vast, empty expanse of the valley, the distant, sharp-edged mountains, the hardy, wind-bent trees. She wasn't looking at it with the awe or fear of a newcomer. She was assessing it, measuring it, as if calculating its dangers and its opportunities. She held herself perfectly still, one hand resting on her lap, the other tucked deep within the folds of her cloak, never straying far from her chest. As they neared his property, the road dipped toward a sturdy wooden bridge that crossed a deep, rock-strewn arroyo. A man was waiting for them on the other side, standing beside a mule laden with mailbags. He was a tall, dignified black man in his late 50s, his preacher's coat faded but clean. "Reverend?" Jack said, pulling the horses to a halt. "Jackson," Reverend Amos Pierce replied, his voice a deep, gentle baritone. The Reverend served not only as Esperanza's preacher, but also as the long-haul mail carrier for the scattered ranches in the valley, a trusted and respected figure to all. His eyes, kind and perceptive, shifted to the woman seated beside Jack. "This is Miss Nora Hart," Jack said, the words feeling inadequate. "She's come to stay." The Reverend gave a small, polite bow of his head. "A pleasure. Ma'am. Welcome to the valley." His gaze was warm, but it held a hint of something else, a shadow of concern. He turned back to Jack, lowering his voice, though the wind nearly snatched the words away. A word. "Jackson, I was in Santa Fe last week. There are men asking questions. A man of means, it seems, sent them north." Jack frowned. Questions about what? The Reverend's eyes flicked to Nora, just for an instant, before returning to Jack. "They're looking for a young woman. Goes by the name of Lily. They say she owes a debt to her former master in New Orleans." The world seemed to halt for a moment. The wind died down. The hammering from the town smithy was a distant echo. Beside him, Jack felt Nora go absolutely rigid. It was not a flinch or a gasp, but a sudden, complete cessation of movement, as if she'd been turned to stone. Her hand, the one inside her cloak, clenched so tightly he could see the white of her knuckles through the fabric. She stared straight ahead, her face a pale, blank mask, but her ash-blue eyes were wide, fixed on the distant horizon as if seeing a ghost rise from the plains. Jack didn't understand the full measure of the Reverend's words. Not yet. Lily, Master, the terms were ugly, relics of a past that still cast long, dark shadows over the country. But he understood the terror he saw reflected in Nora's stillness. It was the primal fear of the hunted. He felt a cold knot form in his gut. The simple, practical arrangement he'd made had just become something far more complicated and far more dangerous. "I see," Jack said, his voice low and gravelly. "Thank you for the telling. Reverend?" "God be with you both," Amos said, his expression somber. He tipped his hat and nudged his mule forward, continuing on his route. Jack clicked the reins, and the wagon rolled onto the bridge, the planks rumbling beneath them. Nora did not move, did not speak. She was a statue of silent dread. Jack wanted to ask, to demand an explanation, but the words wouldn't come. The fear radiating from her was a wall between them, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the core, that this was a storm she had been running from for a very long time. The Rancho Calloway came into view. It was a modest spread, nestled in a crook of the valley that offered some protection from the wind. The house was built of solid timber and river stone, with a low-pitched roof. A sturdy barn stood nearby, along with a series of corrals. The signs of the recent flood were still visible, a line of dark, scoured earth along the creek bed, a pile of debris snagged in the cottonwoods. It was a place of work, not beauty, a testament to persistence against a land that was indifferent to human struggle. He pulled the wagon up before the house and set the brake. "We're here." Nora seemed to draw herself back from a great distance. She blinked once, then twice, her composure returning like a mask being lowered into place. She climbed down from the wagon, her movements once again controlled and precise, and waited as Jack carried her valise to the porch. He opened the door and let her step inside. The main room was spare but clean. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a well-scrubbed wooden table and 2 chairs in the center. A small kitchen area was tucked into one corner. 2 doors led off the main room. "Martha's, my late wife's room is there," he said, gesturing to the left. "I've been using the other one." He paused. "The one on the left is yours. It's clean, fresh linens." Nora walked to the door and looked in. Jack had spent the better part of the week making it ready. The simple bed frame was covered with one of Martha's finer quilts. The floor was swept, and a small vase with a sprig of hardy wild asters sat on the nightstand. It was a gesture of welcome, the best he could manage. She turned back to him, her expression still unreadable. "Thank you, Mr. Calloway." "It's Jack." She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. She did not offer her own first name in return. They stood in the quiet of the house, the space between them filled with unspoken questions and the weight of the Reverend's warning. The wind howled outside, a lonely, mournful sound. "Finally," Nora spoke, her voice clear and firm, as if she were stating the terms of a contract. "Mr. Calloway, I came here to work. I expect no special treatment. I require only a room and board for my labor. We will maintain our own spaces. I will respect your boundaries, and I expect the same in return." It wasn't the speech of a bride, hopeful or nervous. It was the speech of a survivor drawing a line in the sand. It was a demand for safety, for autonomy. Jack looked at this woman, this stranger with haunted eyes and a will of iron. The wife he had advertised for was a partner, someone to share the burden. The woman standing before him looked more like a refugee seeking sanctuary, a soldier digging a trench for a long siege. He thought of the men from Santa Fe, of a girl named Lily, of a debt owed to a master. He didn't know her story, but he knew he was standing on the edge of it. He met her unwavering, ash-blue gaze. "Agreed," he said. The single word hung in the air, a pact made in the heart of the high, lonesome plains. And in that moment, Jack Calloway knew his mail-order bride had brought a trouble far greater than a failing ranch, and a strength he had yet to comprehend. Winter did not arrive in the San Luis Valley. It descended. It came on the back of a fierce northerly wind that stripped the last stubborn leaves from the cottonwoods and left a sheen of ice on the water trough each morning. The world shrank, its colors muted to browns, grays, and the stark white of the snow that now permanently capped the Sangre de Cristo peaks. Inside the Calloway ranch house, a similar quiet and chill had settled. The terms Nora had set on her first day became the unwritten law of their existence. They were 2 solitary planets orbiting a common sun of labor. She rose before him, the scent of coffee and fresh-baked biscuits, a silent greeting when he entered the main room. She worked with a quiet, relentless efficiency that both impressed and unsettled him. She mucked out the stalls, mended fences with neat, strong knots, and kept the house with a meticulous order that left no room for clutter or comfort. She moved through her days with a singular purpose to earn her keep, to be a ghost of utility, leaving no trace of her own desires or personality. Jack, in turn, began to map out the ranch for her, not as a husband showing his wife their shared future, but as a guide showing a traveler the paths to a sanctuary. He walked her through the root cellar, its shelves heavy with preserved vegetables and smoked meats. "This will see us through to April, if we're careful," he said, his voice practical. He showed her the hidden spring high in the rocks that never froze, its location a secret passed down from his father. He taught her the different trails into the hills which were safe after a snow, which offered cover from the wind, which led to dead ends. He was giving her tools for survival, escape routes etched into the land itself. During these lessons, he became acutely aware of her defenses. She never walked beside him, but a half step behind and to the side, maintaining a careful distance. When they were inside the close confines of the barn, she would always find a task that placed her back against a solid wall, her eyes free to scan the wide barn doors. She never let him get between her and an exit. She was a creature of thresholds, always poised for flight. Any sudden noise, a log shifting in the fireplace, the sharp crack of a frozen branch, the groan of a roof beam settling under the weight of early snow would make her freeze, her body going rigid, her hand instinctively flying to the place on her cloak where she kept that sealed envelope hidden. She never flinched outwardly, but Jack saw the flicker of panic deep in her ash-blue eyes before she mastered it. He never mentioned the men from Santa Fe or the name Lily. The words felt like a violation, a key to a door she had locked and barricaded from the inside. He was a man of few words to begin with, and he found that silence was the only language they could safely share. He wrestled with his own instincts. The man in him, the husband he had been to Martha, wanted to protect, to soothe, to break through the wall of her fear. But the wary, observant plainsman in him knew that to push was to threaten, to question was to corner. He saw the way she watched the horizon, the way her gaze would sometimes go distant and unfocused, and he knew he was living with a woman who was simultaneously fighting a war in her past and watching for a new one to appear from the south. The barn became her refuge more than the house. The simple, honest warmth of the animals seemed to soothe a part of her that human company could not reach. Jack would often see her from the house, standing in the middle of the corral, her hands resting on the neck of Juniper, his steady buckskin mare. She would murmur to the horse, her voice too low for him to hear the words, a soft, continuous stream of sound that was vastly different from the clipped, functional way she spoke to him. The animals did not judge, did not demand, did not see her as anything other than a source of hay and a gentle hand. In their presence, the rigid set of her shoulders would soften, just a fraction. It was on an afternoon in late November that the wall between them was irrevocably breached. A bitter wind was carving its way down the valley, sharp enough to bring tears to the eyes. Jack was reinforcing a section of fence on the far pasture when he heard the panicked whinny. He saw Juniper, tangled and struggling, caught fast in a length of old barbed wire left over from a previous owner, the metal barbs tearing at her flank as she thrashed. He ran, his heart pounding. By the time he reached the mare, Nora was already there, having come from the barn. She was speaking to the horse in that same low, calming murmur, holding a pair of wire cutters she'd had the foresight to grab. "Hold her steady," she said, her voice devoid of panic, focused entirely on the task. "I'll cut. Move when I say." Jack gripped Juniper's bridle, speaking his own soothing words as he braced against the horse's terrified shivers. Nora moved with a surgeon's precision, her small, capable hands finding the right place to snip the taut wire. With a final snap, the wire sprang loose. Juniper bolted a few steps, then stood, trembling, blood welling from a long, ugly gash on her side. "Easy, girl," Jack crooned, running a hand down the mare's neck. He led her slowly toward the relative shelter of the barn. Nora followed, her face pale from the cold, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. Inside, the air was warmer, thick with the scent of hay and horsehide. Jack lit a lantern, its yellow glow pushing back against the gray afternoon. He gathered a bucket of warm water, carbolic soap, and clean rags. The cut was deep but clean, as he gently began to wash away the blood and grime. Nora came to stand on the other side of the horse, ready to help hold her if needed. The work was absorbing, requiring his full attention. He focused on the steady rhythm of his hands, the feel of the warm cloth, the mare's occasional shudder. He was so intent on the task that he didn't notice at first. He reached for a fresh rag, and as he turned back, the lantern light fell across Nora's arms. She had pushed up the sleeves of her wool dress to keep them clean. In the flickering light, her right forearm was exposed to the elbow, and it was covered in scars. They were not the clean, straight lines of an accidental cut from a knife or a tool. They were a chaotic network of thin, silvery marks, crisscrossing each other in a terrible tapestry of old pain. Some were faded to faint white lines, others more pronounced, a map of healed-over wounds that spoke of something far more deliberate than a simple accident. Jack stopped breathing. The rag in his hand dripped unnoticed onto the hay-strewn floor. He lifted his gaze from her arm to her face. Her own eyes were fixed on the scars, as if she'd only just become aware of their exposure. When she looked up, her ash-blue eyes met his, and in them, he saw a flash of pure, gut-wrenching shame, quickly masked by her usual stoic calm, but he had seen it. The silence in the barn stretched, thick and heavy. Every secret she carried, every fear that made her jump at shadows, the reason she kept her back to the wall, it was all there, written on her skin. The Reverend's words echoed in his mind. A girl named Lily owes a debt to her former master. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying certainty. He looked at this quiet, hard-working woman who asked for nothing but to be left alone, and he felt a cold, protective rage build in his chest. It wasn't pity. Pity was useless. It was a primal recognition of suffering and a deep, abiding anger at whoever had inflicted it. He spoke, his voice barely a whisper, a low rumble that was more a vow to himself than a statement to her. The cowboy saw the wound she hid and knew his mail-order bride had survived more than anyone knew. Her breath hitched, a tiny, almost inaudible sound. She expected questions, perhaps disgust, or worse, the invasive pity of a stranger. Jack offered none of it. He turned away from her, picked up his heavy sheepskin-lined coat from a hook on the wall, and walked back to her. Without a word, he gently draped it over her shoulders. The coat was large on her, enveloping her in its warmth and the faint, clean scent of leather and winter air. It covered her arms, hiding the scars from the world, a shield offered without a word. Then he turned back to the horse. "Hold the lantern a bit closer," he said, his voice as calm and steady as if nothing had happened. "I need to see this last bit." Nora did as he asked, her movement stiff at first, then more certain. They finished tending to the horse in silence. The wordless pact between them fundamentally changed. He had seen the truth she tried to conceal, and he had not run from it. He had covered it. That night, the worst norther of the season blew in. The wind shrieked around the corners of the house like a living thing, and the temperature plummeted. Jack lay awake in his room, listening to the house groan under the assault. Sometime after midnight, a loose shutter on the main room window broke free and began to slam against the side of the house. Thump! 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 The sound was rhythmic, violent, like a heavy fist pounding on the door, demanding entry. He heard a cry from Nora's room, a sharp, strangled sound of pure terror. He was out of his bed in an instant. Pulling on his trousers, he grabbed his rifle, his first thought being that the men from Santa Fe had found them. But as he entered the main room, he saw her door was wide open. The room was empty. The quilt was thrown back on the bed. Panic seized him. He flung open the main door, the wind tearing it from his grasp. Snow swirled in, biting at his bare chest. He scanned the moonlit yard, his eyes wild. And then he saw them small, bare footprints leading away from the house, toward the outbuildings, toward the granary. He found her huddled in the far corner of the small, windowless building, pressed into the angle of the walls as if trying to merge with the wood. She was in her thin nightgown, her knees drawn up to her chest, her arms wrapped around her legs. She was shivering uncontrollably, her eyes wide and unseeing, fixed on the closed granary door. She was no longer in Colorado. She was somewhere else, somewhere dark and terrible, trapped in a memory brought to life by the relentless pounding of the shutter. Jack's first instinct was to rush to her, to wrap her in a blanket, to hold her until the shaking stopped. But he remembered the scars. He remembered her flinching away from even the possibility of a touch. To touch her now, in this state, would be another assault. Slowly, deliberately, he propped his rifle against the wall just inside the door. He didn't speak. He simply walked to the opposite corner, a dozen feet away from her, and sat down on the hard-packed earth floor, leaning his back against the rough-hewn planks. He pulled his own knees up, mirroring her posture, and fixed his gaze on the same door she was watching. He did not speak. He did not move closer. He just sat. He became a silent, steady presence in the dark, a guard at his post. He was a wall between her and whatever ghosts were clawing at the door. Hours passed. The wind howled. The shutter continued its violent rhythm. Nora's shivering slowly subsided. Her breathing, which had been ragged and shallow, began to deepen. Jack never took his eyes off the door. He sat watch, a silent guardian against the storm, both outside and within. Just before the first light of dawn painted the eastern sky a pale, bruised purple, the wind finally began to die down. The pounding of the shutter ceased. In the sudden, profound silence, he heard a small sound from her corner. He turned his head. Nora had lifted her face from her knees. Her eyes were no longer wide with terror, but clear and exhausted. They were focused on him. She looked at him, sitting there in the cold, his bare chest exposed to the frigid air. And for the first time since she had arrived in the San Luis Valley, he saw something in her gaze other than fear or neutrality. It was a flicker of disbelief, a fragile, questioning thing. It was the barest hint of trust, a tiny crack in the ice, born in the quiet aftermath of a shared vigil. The dawn that followed the night in the granary broke clear and cold. The world scrubbed clean by the wind. An unspoken treaty had been forged in the shared silence of that long watch. When Nora entered the main room, she found the broken shutter propped against the wall and a pot of coffee already brewing. She met Jack's eyes across the room, and for the first time, she did not immediately look away. She gave a single, slow nod of acknowledgement. It was enough. The incident had changed something in Jack. He realized that passive defense teaching her the layout of the land, giving her space, was insufficient. The threat that followed her was a tangible thing, a hunting party that would not be deterred by distance or discretion. Her terror had not been that of a startled woman, but of a cornered animal who knew the scent of its pursuer. He needed to build a better cage, not to trap her, but to shield her. His gaze fell upon the root cellar. It was deep, cool, and dug into the hard-packed earth beneath the house, its entrance a heavy trap door in the pantry floor. The following day, he began to work. He told her he was expanding it for more winter storage, a plausible lie that required no further explanation, but his work was covert and precise. He dug deeper into the back wall, carving out a small, secondary chamber, just large enough for one person to sit or lie down comfortably. He shored up the walls with thick timber beams, leaving no sign of the hollow space behind a false back of stacked potato crates. He spent days on his hands and knees in the dark, painstakingly running a narrow pipe from the hidden spring down the hill, feeding it through the rock foundation and into the secret room, ensuring a source of fresh water that was independent of the well. He moved sacks of dried jerky, bags of flour, and tins of lard into the main cellar, creating a stockpile that looked practical but was, in fact, a siege provision. While he worked, Nora watched. She never asked what he was truly doing, but he saw the understanding in her eyes. He was building a hiding place, a bolt hole. He was turning his home into a fortress for her. This silent act of fortification seemed to unlatch something within Nora. She began to claim small pieces of the world for herself. The new calves, born weak and shivering in the harsh cold, became her domain. She would sit with them for hours in the hay, rubbing them with rough burlap sacks to stimulate their circulation, coaxing them to take milk. Jack, watching from the doorway of the barn, saw a tenderness in her that she kept locked away from him. One afternoon, a low, melodic sound drifted from the barn. It was so faint he thought at first it was the wind in the eaves, but as he drew closer, he recognized it as singing. Her voice was low and clear, a simple, sad tune from the old country. She was singing to the horses, a private concert for an audience that offered only quiet acceptance. It was the first beautiful thing he had heard on the ranch since Martha had passed, and it struck him with a force that left him breathless. This was the Nora who wrote in a fine, elegant hand, the Nora who could calm a panicked horse, a woman hidden beneath layers of fear and survival. Recognizing that a fortress was useless without the means to defend it, Jack decided it was time for the next step. He brought out his Winchester 73, the blued steel gleaming in the pale winter light. He set up a row of empty tins on a fence post 50 yards from the house. "Every soul in the territory should know how to use one of these," he stated, his tone matter of fact. He held the rifle out to her. She stared at it as if it were a snake. She flinched, not from the weapon itself, but from what it represented: violence, noise, a loss of control. I cannot," she whispered, her voice tight. "You can," he said, his own voice gentle but firm. "It's a tool. Nothing more. It doesn't have a will of its own." He saw the struggle in her face, the deep-seated fear warring with the practical understanding that he was right. Hesitantly, she took the rifle. It was heavy and awkward in her hands. He didn't reach out to correct her grip, instead instructing her with his words. He showed her how to work the lever action, how to sight down the barrel. "The most important part," he said, standing a respectful distance away, "is your breath. The kick and the noise will try to scare you. Don't let them. Breathe in slow. Fill your lungs. Let half of it out. Hold it. Squeeze the trigger. Don't pull it. Just a slow, steady squeeze until it surprises you." She raised the rifle to her shoulder, the stock clumsy against her small frame. She sighted on the tins, her knuckles white. She took a ragged breath. The explosion was deafening in the still air, a violent crack that echoed off the mountains. The rifle kicked hard, slamming into her shoulder. The shot went wide, kicking up dirt a dozen feet from the target. Nora staggered back, dropping the rifle as if it had burned her, her hands flying up to cover her ears. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide with a familiar, haunted look. The sound had transported her back to a place of terror. Jack did not move toward her. He waited. He let the echo die, let the silence of the valley rush back in. He let her find her own ground. After a long moment, she lowered her hands, her breathing shaky. "The sound?" she said, her voice trembling. "I know," he said softly. "It's just noise. You are here. You are safe. The noise is yours to make. You control it." They stood there for a long time. Jack thought the lesson was over, but then, with a resolve that stunned him, Nora bent down, picked up the rifle, and cradled it in her arms. She stood, took a deep, shuddering breath, and raised it to her shoulder again. He repeated the instruction, his voice a low, steady anchor in the ringing silence. Breathe in, hold, squeeze. The second shot was just as loud, the kick just as jarring, but this time she was ready for it. She held her ground, and the shot, while still a miss, was closer. A spark of something not triumph, but grim satisfaction flickered in her eyes. They continued this way every afternoon for a week. The rifle slowly became less of a monster and more of a tool in her hands. She never hit the tins, but that wasn't the point. The point was that she did not run from the noise anymore. She was learning to stand in the echo of her own power. One morning, the familiar sight of Reverend Amos Pierce and his mule appeared on the road. As was his custom, he stopped for a cup of coffee and a moment of rest. After exchanging pleasantries and news of the valley, he drew a letter from his satchel and handed it to Jack. This came by way of a friend, the Reverend said, his eyes conveying a meaning his words did not. From a man who used to ride with the Army Scouts. Jack took the letter. The postmark was from Trinidad, a town to the south, near the New Mexico border. He waited until the Reverend had departed before opening it. The handwriting was a rough scrawl, the words blunt and to the point. Callaway. It read, "You asked about inquiries in Santa Fe. The man paying is Martin Beauregard, a planter from Louisiana way. Owns half a county down there. Word is he's looking for runaway property. Not the first time. He runs a quiet trade, moving girls up from the port in New Orleans where the law is flexible. They say he's got a temper and a long reach. Be watchful. Your friend, Abe." Jack read the letter twice, the name Martin Beauregard burning itself into his mind. It gave the faceless threat a name, and the name carried the weight of power and cruelty. A quiet trade. The words made his stomach turn. He folded the letter and tucked it into his shirt pocket, the paper a heavy weight against his chest. His instinct was to tell Nora, to warn her, but what good would it do? It would only feed the fear that he was trying so hard to help her starve. For now, this burden would be his alone. He was unaware that Nora was fighting her own battle, in her own way. 2 nights later, long after Jack was asleep, she sat at the small table in her room. By the light of a single candle, she pulled the sealed envelope from its hiding place inside her dress. It contained a few dollars, a faded tintype of a woman who might have been her mother, and several sheets of clean paper. With a pen and a small bottle of ink, she began to write. Her elegant script flowed across the page, a stark contrast to the rough scrawl of Abe's letter. She wrote not to family or friends, but to the Philadelphia Society for Assisting Distressed Persons, an address she had memorized years ago, a name whispered among women in shadowed places. It was a Quaker organization, known for its quiet, steadfast opposition to all forms of bondage. She did not pour out her soul. She did not describe her pain. Her letter was as spare and factual as a legal deposition. She gave her real name, Nora Mae Stevenson, and her place of birth in Kansas. She stated that she had been held against her will for several years by a man named Martin Beauregard of Louisiana. She described, in the briefest of terms, her escape and her current location. She asked for nothing. She made no plea. She simply bore witness to her own existence, a statement of fact sent out into the vast, indifferent world. "I am alive," the letter declared. "I am here, and I am no longer his." She sealed the letter, addressed it, and tucked it away. The next time Reverend Amos made his rounds, she would give it to him. It was a small act, a single candle lit in a vast darkness, but it was hers. For the first time in years, she was not just running or hiding. She was fighting back, using the only weapon she had, her words, her name, her truth. The map of the ranch Jack had drawn for her, which lay on her nightstand, had started to change. Initially, she had studied it as an escape plan, memorizing the ravines and hidden trails. But now, she saw it differently. She knew the patch of wild mint that grew by the creek, the high ledge where the eagles nested, the quiet grove of aspens whose leaves turned to gold in the fall. The lines on the paper were no longer just routes of egress. They were becoming the geography of a life, a place of belonging. The first hint of the dry season came with a hot southern wind. The snows receded, and the high plains grass cured to a pale, combustible gold. One afternoon, the sky to the west turned a sickly, bruised orange. The smell of smoke, sharp and resinous, tainted the air. A wildfire, likely started by a lightning strike in the tinder-dry foothills, was racing across the valley floor, driven by the relentless wind. "The herd," Jack said, his voice tight with urgency. "We have to move them, now." The fire was still miles away, but the wind was in its favor. Their only chance was to drive the cattle east, through a narrow, rocky canyon known as Arroyo del Cobre, which would act as a natural firebreak. The work was frantic, a controlled chaos of shouting, whistling, and the panicked lowing of cattle. They worked together, a seamless team. Jack on his horse and Nora on foot, her agility and surprising strength keeping the stragglers from breaking away. The smoke grew thicker, stinging their eyes, catching in their throats. The sun was blotted out. The world plunged into an eerie, orange twilight. They funneled the herd into the mouth of the canyon, the rock walls rising steeply on either side. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of terror. A dislodged rock sent a young steer stumbling, and for a terrifying moment, the herd threatened to stampede backward. "I can't see," Nora yelled, her voice choked with smoke, her eyes streaming. She was lost in the swirling dust and terrified animals. Jack spurred his horse closer, leaning down from the saddle, his hand outstretched. "Here, take my hand, don't let go." In the heart of the smoke and chaos, she reached up, her hand, calloused and strong, grasped his. It wasn't a gesture of comfort or romance. It was a lifeline, an anchor in the storm. It was the first time they had touched by mutual, desperate choice. His grip was firm, her fingers locking with his. For a moment, they were just two people, connected, pushing against a world on fire. Together, they plunged forward, pulling the led cow with them, their linked hands a silent testament to the bond that had been forged in silence. Fear, and the shared will to survive. The aftermath of the fire left a changed landscape, both on the plains and between the two people who called the Callaway Ranch home. The earth was scarred black in wide swaths, but the Arroyo del Cobre had held, a rocky fortress against the flames. The herd was safe, albeit rattled. The shared crisis, the desperate grasp of hands through the choking smoke, had burned away a layer of the formal distance between them. A quiet understanding had taken its place, a sense of shared survival that needed no words. Spring arrived tentatively, as it always did in the high country. It was not a gentle awakening, but a fierce, reluctant thaw. Green shoots, vibrant and defiant, pushed their way through the scorched soil. The creek, fed by melting snow, ran high and fast, its voice a constant murmur. The wind, for the first time in months, occasionally carried the scent of damp earth and new life instead of just dust and ice. In this season of renewal, a subtle shift occurred in Nora. The rigid watchfulness in her posture began to soften. She still chose her seat with her back to a wall, but her eyes were not always fixed on the door. Jack would catch her watching the new calves kick up their heels in the pasture, a faint, wistful smile touching her lips before she caught herself and smoothed it away. She spoke more, not in long conversations, but in small offerings. An observation about the weather, a question about a particular cow's temperament. Her voice, when not clipped by necessity, was a low, pleasant alto, and Jack found himself listening for it. He, too, was changing. His patience, born of a life spent waiting for seasons to turn and cattle to grow, was being reshaped. He was learning a new kind of waiting. He was waiting for her to feel safe, not just from the world outside, but from the ghosts within. He no longer saw her simply as a survivor to be sheltered, but as a woman of profound and quiet strength. The image of her standing firm against the Winchester's kick, of her grim satisfaction in the face of her own fear, was etched in his mind. Their days fell into a rhythm of hard, shareward work. They were a team, their movements often synchronized without a word passing between them. They rebuilt the section of fence the fire had claimed, repaired the roof of the shed, and cleared the irrigation ditches for the spring planting. The physical space between them had shrunk, but the emotional chasm, though narrowing, remained. The midpoint of spring brought with it the season of new calves, a time of exhaustion and hope. One afternoon, Jack noticed that a young heifer, a first-time mother, was in distress. He'd been watching her for hours, her labor long and unproductive. He brought her into the relative comfort of the barn, the air thick with the sweet, metallic scent of hay and birth. As he worked, the sky outside underwent a strange and sudden transformation. The brilliant blue of the morning drained away, replaced by a sickly, greenish-gray pallor. A profound stillness fell over the valley, the wind dying completely. An unnerving, metallic tang filled the air. "Hail," Jack said, his voice grim as he glanced out the wide barn doors. "A bad one, by the looks of it." Nora, who had been preparing a warm mash for the other cows, came to stand beside him. The first stone hit the tin roof with a sharp crack, as loud as a gunshot, then another and another, until the sound became a deafening, continuous roar, as if 1,000 hammers were pounding on the roof, trying to beat their way in. The world outside dissolved into a white, churning chaos as ice stones the size of hen's eggs battered the earth. Inside the barn, the noise was a physical assault. The animals grew frantic in their stalls, their eyes wide with terror. The laboring heifer let out a low, agonized moan. "She's in trouble," Jack said, his focus returning to the animal. "The calf, it's not coming right." He worked gently, his years of experience evident in his sure hands. But his expression grew tighter, his jaw set. After a few minutes, he straightened up, wiping a sweat-soaked arm across his brow. He looked at Nora, and she saw a flicker of despair in his eyes. "It's a breech. Hips first. I don't think I can turn it." The implication hung in the thunderous air. They would lose the calf, and very likely the mother, too. Nora stared at the struggling animal, her mind racing. The violent drumming on the roof, the cow's painful cries, the sense of impending loss had all threatened to overwhelm her. But then a memory surfaced, sharp and clear, a memory from Kansas, from a life before this one, a hard-faced woman, a neighbor whose name she'd long forgotten, kneeling in the dirt beside a similarly struggling ewe. The woman had not been gentle. She had been fierce, a warrior fighting for a single, fragile life. "Wait," Nora said, her voice cutting through the din. She moved forward, pushing up the sleeves of her dress. "There's something. I saw it once. Let me try." Jack looked at her, his expression a mixture of surprise and doubt. But he saw the look on her face, the same grim, focused resolve she'd had when she picked up the rifle after it had terrified her. He stepped back, giving her room. Nora knelt in the hay, ignoring the damp and the grime. She spoke to the heifer in a low, steady murmur, the same crooning sound she used with the horses. Her hands, though small, were surprisingly strong and sure. She worked not with brute force, but with a strange, intuitive grace, shifting and probing, her brow furrowed in concentration. It was a desperate, primal struggle in the heart of the storm. Finally, with a great effort from the heifer, the calf was born. It slid out onto the hay, a slick, motionless heap, its body limp and its color a worrying blue. It wasn't breathing. "It's too late," Jack said softly, his voice full of a weary sadness. No, Nora insisted, her voice fierce. She grabbed a rough burlap sack and began rubbing the tiny creature's chest and back, her movements vigorous, almost violent. She was trying to shock it into life. She cleared the mucus from its nose and mouth with her fingers. Then, remembering the Kansas woman, she leaned down. She covered the calf's wet nose with her own mouth and blew a short, sharp puff of air into its lungs. Once, twice. She worked with a frantic intensity, her hair coming loose from its bun, her face streaked with sweat and grime. She refused to give up, pouring all of her own will, her own history of survival, into this one, tiny, helpless creature. "Come on," she whispered, her voice a raw plea. "Breathe, just breathe." And then, a flicker, a tiny, almost imperceptible twitch of an ear. A shudder ran through the small body. The calf's side gave a hitching, ragged heave. It took a breath, then another. A thin, reedy wail filled the barn, cutting through the roar of the hail. It was alive. Nora sat back on her heels, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief. She looked at the new life she had just coaxed back from the brink, its wet coat steaming in the cool air. Jack stared, his face a mask of stunned disbelief. He looked from the breathing, bleeding calf to the woman kneeling in the hay. He saw not the quiet, fearful mail-order bride, but a force of nature, a woman who knew the brutal calculus of life and death and refused to accept defeat. He was overwhelmed by a wave of emotion so powerful it stole his breath. Gratitude, awe, a profound and aching tenderness. He moved to her side, kneeling in the hay beside her. He didn't think. He didn't plan. He acted. He reached out and gently brushed a stray lock of damp hair from her forehead. And then he leaned in and pressed a soft, brief kiss against her brow. It was not a kiss of passion or of ownership. It was a kiss of reverence, a benediction, a thank you that words could not express. Nora froze. Her eyes fluttered shut. Jack felt the tremor that went through her. And for a heart-stopping moment, he thought he had made a terrible mistake, that he had crossed a line and shattered the fragile trust they had built. But she did not pull away. She did not flinch. She simply knelt there, in the warmth of the barn, with a hailstorm raging outside, and accepted the touch. That night, the storm passed, leaving behind a world scoured clean and glittering with melting ice. They sat before the fire in the main room, a rare moment of stillness. The rescued calf was sleeping soundly in a warm stall beside its mother. They had worked for an hour in silence, cleaning up, their movements easy and familiar. But a new awareness hung in the air between them, a charge left over from the intensity of the afternoon. Jack looked at her profile illuminated by the firelight. He saw the strength in the line of her jaw, the deep weariness in her eyes. He had to know. He had to give her the chance to tell him. "I've lived on this land my whole life," he said, his voice low, breaking the comfortable silence. "And I have never seen anything like what you did today." Nora was quiet for a long time, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. When she finally spoke, her voice was so soft he had to lean forward to hear it. "My name is Nora," she said. "Nora Mae Stevenson." The words were a revelation. It was the first piece of her past she had offered freely, a key to a locked room. Jack let the name settle in the quiet space between them. "Nora Mae Stevenson," he repeated softly, testing the feel of it. It suited her far better than the plain, functional Nora Hart she had used as a shield. She took a slow, deep breath, as if steeling herself. "Lily," she said, the name a bitter taste on her tongue. That was a name he used. A label, like branding a calf to show it was his property. She unconsciously raised a hand to her throat, her fingers tracing a line just below her jaw. "He liked to remind me who I belonged to. Sometimes, if I was too slow, or if I looked at him the wrong way, he would press his thumb there, just to make the point." She lowered her hand. But Jack could still see it, the ghost of a possessive touch, a mark of cruelty that had sunk deeper than the skin. The shame she had carried for so long was palpable in the firelit room. A heavy, suffocating blanket. He saw the flicker of it in her eyes, the shame of the victim, the terrible, twisted belief that the violation was somehow her fault. The protective rage he had felt in the barn months ago rose in him again, cold and sharp. But he mastered it. Pity would be an insult. Horror would only deepen her shame. What she needed was not his anger at another man, but his absolute belief in her. He met her gaze, his own eyes clear and steady. "Whatever was done to you," he said, his voice firm, unwavering, imbued with a conviction that came from the very core of his being. "Their sins are their own. They don't belong to you." He leaned forward slightly, emphasizing his next words. "In my eyes, Nora Mae Stevenson, you are whole." He had called her by her true name. He had not just heard her, he had validated her. He had taken the shame she offered him and refused it, handing back her dignity, clean and untarnished. Tears welled in Nora's eyes, shimmering in the firelight, but they were not the tears of fear or sorrow he had seen glimpses of before. These were different. They were tears of release. A single drop escaped and traced a slow path down her cheek. She did not wipe it away. That night, for the first time, Jack set two places at the table, side by side. When Nora came to join him, she did not hesitate. They ate their simple meal of beef stew and biscuits together. The silence that fell between them was no longer a void, an absence of words. It was a shared space. It was the quiet of a winter field, resting, gathering strength under a blanket of snow, waiting for the inevitable spring. It was the beginning of a new language, one that had no need for sound. The fragile peace that had settled over the Calloway Ranch was as delicate as the new green shoots on the prairie, and just as vulnerable to being crushed. The shared understanding that had grown between Jack and Nora was a quiet, private thing, nurtured in the shelter of the valley. But the world was larger than their small patch of land, and its tendrils were beginning to reach for them. It began, as such things often do, with whispers. The news traveled from the saloons and sewing circles of Esperanza, carried on the wind like bitter dust. A stranger had been in town, a well-dressed man asking quiet questions, buying rounds of whiskey and letting his tongue loosen. The story he told was a simple, ugly one, a tale of a runaway girl, a thief named Lily who had stolen from a benevolent master and fled north. The description he gave was vague, but when he mentioned she had come to the valley on the late autumn stage, every eye turned metaphorically toward the Calloway Ranch. Reverend Amos was the one who brought the news directly to them. He rode out on a clear afternoon, his face etched with a gravity that went beyond his usual Sunday sermon demeanor. He accepted a dipper of water but refused coffee, a sign that his visit was not social. "Jackson," he said, standing by the porch rail, his gaze on the far mountains, "there is a man in town. His name is Martin Beauregard." The name landed like a stone in the quiet air. Jack saw Nora, who was mending a harness nearby, go perfectly still. Her hands, which had been moving with swift efficiency, froze over the leather. "He's staying at the boarding house," the Reverend continued, his voice low. "He's hired a lawyer out of Trinidad, a man named Fletcher, and he's had a long meeting with Sheriff Doyle." Jack's jaw tightened. He knew Sheriff Doyle, a man whose spine was as flexible as the money offered to him. Doyle was not a bad man in the way a wolf is bad. He was a weak man, which was often more dangerous. He enforced the laws that were convenient and profitable, and looked the other way for the right price. "The story he's telling," Amos said, finally looking at them, his eyes full of a deep, sorrowful anger. "Is that his indentured servant? A girl he calls Lily broke her contract and stole a considerable sum of money before she fled. He says he has come not for punishment, but simply to reclaim his legal property." The silence that followed was broken only by the cry of a hawk circling high above. The word property hung between them, obscene and suffocating. Nora's face was a pale, carved mask of composure. But Jack saw the tremor in her hands before she deliberately set the harness aside and clasped them in her lap. After the Reverend left, a new kind of quiet descended on the ranch. It was not the quiet of peace, but the taut, humming silence before a lightning strike. Jack's response was immediate and methodical. He did not speak of the threat. He prepared for it. He became a man of iron and wood. He spent the next several days riding his entire fence line, not just checking for breaks, but reinforcing every post, tightening every strand of wire until the boundary of his land was as unyielding as he could make it. He replaced the old wooden bolt on the front door of the house with a heavy iron bar he commissioned from the blacksmith. He planed the window frames until they shut without a single gap, securing them with new, stronger latches. Every evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, he would step out into the yard with the Winchester. The rifle lessons with Nora were over. This was different. This was practice. He set up a series of targets at varying distances and began to shoot. The sharp crack of the rifle became the new sound of twilight at the ranch. He worked with a cold, focused fury, his movements economical, his aim improving with every shot. He was not just practicing. He was sending a message, a declaration in gunpowder and lead that this land, and everyone on it, was under his protection. Nora watched him, but her own preparations took a different form. While Jack fortified their perimeter with wire and iron, she began to build fences of a different kind, fences of human connection. She did not retreat into the shell of the frightened woman who had first arrived, the woman who had coaxed a calf back to life, who had claimed her own name in the firelight, would not be so easily broken. Instead, she walked out. Her first visit was to the small, isolated camp on the edge of the valley where a Ute family, the Skylances, lived. They were regarded with suspicion by most of the townsfolk, left to themselves. Nora approached not with words, but with offering a sack of flour and a side of fresh cured bacon. She set it on a rock a respectful distance from their wickiup and retreated. The next day, she returned, not with food, but with a piece of smooth slate and a lump of charcoal. She sat on the ground and, in her clear, elegant hand, began to draw the letters of the alphabet. The children, hesitant at first, crept closer, their dark eyes wide with curiosity. She spoke their names and then wrote them, showing them the magic of how a person could be captured in a series of simple marks. Her next visit was to the Joseph family. Samuel and Sarah Joseph were freed people from Tennessee who had made a life for themselves on the outskirts of Esperanza, taking in laundry. Their two small daughters, Martha and Rose, were bright-eyed and quick, but like the Ute children, had no access to schooling. Nora made the same offer. Soon, a strange and wonderful schoolhouse was established in the Calloway barn. Every afternoon, a small, diverse group of students would gather. The Skylance children, the Joseph girls, and even the young son of the blacksmith, who was more interested in Nora's patient teaching than his father's loud forge. The barn, which had once been Nora's private refuge, became a place of community. On the wide, clean-swept space of a stall door, she drew the alphabet in charcoal. The letters A, B, C stood stark and clear, a testament to a different kind of power. It was the power of a name, of a story, of a voice. It was a barricade built of knowledge. This quiet act of defiance did not go unnoticed. Rumors were a two-way street, while tales of Lily the thief circulated in the saloon. New stories began to emerge from the women who brought their laundry to Sarah Joseph, or the men who saw the small cluster of children heading toward the Calloway ranch. They saw a woman who, despite the ugly whispers surrounding her, was investing in the community's most overlooked members, Mrs. Gable, the proprietor of the general store, who had once eyed Nora with deep suspicion, now saved a piece of horehound candy for her when she came in for supplies. The blacksmith began to nod to Jack with a new respect. The town, which had been a unified wall of judgment, was beginning to crack, factions forming in the court of public opinion. The confrontation, when it came, was not one of violence, but of law or a perversion of it. Martin Beauregard, tired of the slow-moving whispers, made his official move. He emerged one morning from the boarding house, dressed impeccably in a tailored brown suit and a fine bowler hat. He walked with the unhurried, confident stride of a man for whom the world was an asset to be managed. He was not a brutish villain. He was worse. He was a man of cold, polite entitlement. A man who saw his will and the law as one and the same. Accompanied by his lawyer and Sheriff Doyle, he walked to the post office. An hour later, a notice was tacked to the public board on the front of the building. It was a crisp, legal-looking document, the text printed in sharp, clear type. It was a formal petition to the territorial magistrate, filed by Martin Beauregard, for the immediate return of his indentured property, a woman known to him as Lily, who had absconded from her legal obligations in New Orleans. It cited territorial statutes on runaway servants and claimed damages for theft. It was, in effect, a bill of sale for a human being, posted for the entire valley to see. Jack saw it first. He had ridden into town for grain, and the small crowd gathered around the post office door drew his attention. He read the document, his vision narrowing until only the words property and Lily remained. The cold rage he felt was so pure it was almost calming. He turned his horse around and rode back to the ranch, not at a gallop, but at a steady, deliberate pace. The time for preparation was over. The fight was here. He found Nora in the barn, pointing to the letter Q on the stall door for a wrapped Martha Joseph. He stood in the doorway, his large frame blocking the light. The children fell silent, sensing the change in the air. "It's time to go," Nora said to her small students. "We'll learn about it tomorrow." After they had scattered, she turned to Jack. She didn't need to ask. She saw the truth in his grim face. "He's posted a notice," Jack said, his voice flat. "A legal claim. In town. For everyone to see." His hand rested on the iron bar he had installed on the house's main door. His plan was simple. They would retreat. They would use the fortress he had built. They had food, water, and guns. They would wait them out. "We'll stay here. Let them come." Nora looked at him. She looked around the barn, at the alphabet she had written on the door, a symbol of the voice she had been trying to reclaim. She thought of the hiding place in the root cellar, a space of darkness and fear. She had spent a lifetime in hiding places. She had run from New Orleans, hidden her past in Kansas, and sought refuge in the silence of this valley. But the woman who taught children their own names could no longer live like a fugitive. She walked past Jack, out of the barn and into the harsh, bright sunlight. She looked toward the town, toward the man who had stolen her name and tried to steal her soul. Her shoulders were straight. Her chin was up. "No," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with a finality that stunned him. "No more running, no more hiding." She turned to face him, and her ash-blue eyes, once so full of fear, now held the hard, clear light of resolve. He posted that notice to shame a woman named Lily. Lily is a ghost. He will be answered by Nora Mae Stevenson. Jack stared at her, at the incredible, unshakable courage of this woman who had survived more than he could imagine. He had built a fortress of wood and iron to protect her, but she had built a stronger one inside herself, one made of dignity and truth. His plan to hide and fight dissolved in the face of her strength. They would not cower behind walls. They would walk into the open. He gave a single, sharp nod. He went to the corral, saddled his own horse, and then, for the first time, he saddled the gentle mare, Juniper, for her. He led the horses to the front of the house. Nora met him there, her simple wool dress neat, her hair pulled back, her cloak drawn around her shoulders like a suit of armor. She carried nothing else. She allowed him to help her into the saddle. He mounted his own horse, and they sat for a moment, side by side, looking not at each other, but down the long, dusty road to Esperanza. They were riding out to meet the enemy, not with an army, but with nothing more than the truth. And as they spurred their horses forward, leaving the sanctuary of the ranch behind, they rode not as a rancher and his mail-order bride, but as partners, heading into a battle for her name, her freedom, and her life. The Highline Saloon had never been so quiet on a weekday afternoon. Every chair, stool, and crate was occupied. Men who ought to have been in their fields or at their forges stood shoulder to shoulder along the back wall, their hats in their hands, their faces a mixture of curiosity and grim judgment. The air, usually thick with the smells of stale beer and sawdust, was charged with an electric tension. The long bar had been cleared, and at its center, perched on a high-backed chair brought over from the barber shop, sat Judge Thaddeus Ashby. He was a circuit judge, a man whose face was a roadmap of long, dusty miles, and whose eyes, behind a pair of steel-rimmed spectacles, missed nothing. At a small table to the judge's right sat Martin Beauregard and his lawyer, Fletcher. Beauregard was the picture of calm, Southern aristocracy, his brown suit immaculate, his hands resting on a silver-headed cane. He surveyed the rough-hewn crowd with an air of detached amusement, as if observing a quaint local custom. Fletcher, a man with a ferret's sharp face and restless eyes, had a stack of documents before him, the most prominent of which was a bill of sale, its script ornate and its edges yellowed with age. At a matching table to the left sat Jack and Nora. Jack was stiff and uncomfortable in his Sunday best, his large, calloused hands resting on his knees. He looked like a mountain that had been forced indoors, but his gaze was fixed and steady, a silent promise to the woman beside him. Nora was the calmest person in the room. Her posture was straight, her hands folded loosely in her lap. She had met Beauregard's eyes once when he entered, a single, unwavering look that held no fear, only a cold, quiet acknowledgement. She had refused to be Lily the Ghost. She was Nora Mae Stevenson, and she would not be invisible. Sheriff Doyle stood near the judge, trying to look impartial but shifting his weight nervously, his eyes darting frequently to Beauregard's table. "This is not a formal court of law," Judge Ashby began, his voice surprisingly powerful, cutting through the silence. "But a petition has been filed, and in the absence of a proper courthouse, we will hear it. Mr. Fletcher, you may present your client's claim." Fletcher rose, a smug smile on his face. "Thank you, Your Honor. The matter before us is, in fact, remarkably simple, a matter of property rights, a cornerstone of our great nation." He picked up the bill of sale. "My client, Mr. Martin Beauregard, is the legal guardian and master of an indentured servant known as Lily. This document, signed and notarized in the city of New Orleans, proves his claim. Several years ago, this girl," he gestured dismissively toward Nora, "violated the terms of her contract, stole money and goods from Mr. Beauregard's home, and fled. My client, in his magnanimity, has not sought punitive damages. He has traveled a great distance simply to reclaim what is legally and rightfully his." He laid the document on the bar before the judge. He then proceeded to paint a picture of Nora as a conniving, ungrateful thief, embellishing the tale with details of her supposed deceit. Through it all, he referred to her only as Lily or the girl, stripping her of her identity, reducing her to a line item in a ledger. The crowd murmured, some men nodding at the familiar logic of property and ownership, others shifting uncomfortably. Beauregard listened with a faint, paternalistic smile, as if hearing the story of a beloved but wayward pet. When Fletcher finished, Judge Ashby peered at Nora over his spectacles. "Ma'am, do you have a response to this claim?" Before the Nora could speak, Jack stood up. His movement was slow, deliberate, drawing every eye in the room. He was not a man of fancy words, and he did not try to be. "Your Honor," he began, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. "Mr. Fletcher is right about one thing. This is a simple matter." He looked not at the judge, but at the faces in the crowd, the blacksmith, the store owner, the ranchers he had known his whole life. "The woman sitting next to me," he said, his voice gaining strength, "is not a piece of property. She is a person. Her name is not Lily. Her name is Nora Mae Stevenson. She was born a free citizen in the state of Kansas." A ripple of surprise went through the room. Kansas? A free state? "This man," Jack continued, nodding toward a scowling Beauregard, "can wave around any piece of paper he likes. But we fought a war in this country not 20 years ago to settle this very question. We settled it with blood and cannon fire, and the answer we came to was that you cannot own a person. Not with a contract, not with a bill of sale, not with a brand." He took a step forward, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "The 13th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States makes any and all forms of slavery or involuntary servitude illegal. It makes that piece of paper he's so proud of worthless. It's a relic from a time we buried. A man's life, a woman's life, is her own. It does not belong to another." He turned to the judge. "That is the law. Not just the law of this territory, but the law of the land. There is no claim to here, Your Honor. There is only a free woman, and a man who is breaking federal law by trying to take her freedom." Jack sat down. The silence in the saloon was absolute. He hadn't used legal tricks or flowery language. He had spoken the plain, hard truth. A truth that resonated with the fierce, independent spirit of the frontier. Men looked at Beauregard not as a gentleman reclaiming his property, but as something else entirely, a relic, a tyrant from a defeated world. Judge Ashby picked up the bill of sale, holding it between his thumb and forefinger as if it were something unclean. He looked at Beauregard, his eyes cold. "Mr. Beauregard, this document appears to be a contract of ownership over a human being." Fletcher started to bluster. "Your Honor, it is a contract of indenture, perfectly legal at the time." "The time has passed. Mr. Fletcher," the judge said sharply. "The law of the United States is unequivocal on this matter." He was about to speak again, to render his decision, when Fletcher caught the eye of two rough-looking men standing near the saloon's swinging doors. The lawyer gave a nearly imperceptible nod. "Before you make a ruling that may have unforeseen consequences." "Your Honor," Fletcher said loudly, his voice a clear interruption. "Perhaps we should take a brief recess for my client to consider his options." It was the signal. As Judge Ashby frowned at the interruption, the two men at the door shoved their way forward. A third man, who had been leaning against the bar, moved to block Jack's path. Their intent was clear and brutally simple: to snatch Nora in the confusion and drag her out into the street where a wagon waited. The crowd gasped. Stumbling back, Jack surged to his feet, but the man in front of him was large and ready. Before Jack could even throw a punch, he felt a firm tug on his sleeve. "Jack, this way now." It was Nora. Her face was pale, but her eyes were blazing. She had not screamed or frozen. She had acted. She pulled him hard, not toward the back of the saloon, but toward a side door that led to the narrow alley between the saloon and the general store. The ambushers, expecting a struggle toward the main entrance, were caught off guard for a precious second. They burst out into the alley and into the harsh afternoon sun. "The arroyo," Nora yelled, already running. She was leading him, pulling him toward the edge of town, toward the jagged slash in the earth he had shown her months ago. The Arroyo del Cobre, the escape route. The sounds of pursuit were immediate heavy boots pounding on the hard-packed earth. A man's angry shout. A wagon rattled to life on the main street, its wheels churning up dust as it raced to cut them off at the mouth of the canyon. They scrambled down the steep embankment into the arroyo. The dry creek bed a maze of rocks and sun-bleached boulders. Nora moved with a certainty that amazed him, her memory of the path flawless. The canyon walls rose around them, offering a fleeting sense of cover. The hired guns were on foot, clambering down into the arroyo behind them, while the wagon raced along the canyon rim, its driver trying to find a spot to head them off. A gunshot echoed in the narrow space, a bullet whining off a rock face near Jack's head. He shoved Nora behind a large boulder and drew his own pistol. "Stay here," he commanded. "No," she said, her voice tight but controlled. She was rummaging in the saddle pack on his horse, which he had tethered just inside the canyon. "Give me the Winchester." He stared at her for a second, then understood. He fired 2 shots back at their pursuers, forcing them to take cover, while Nora pulled the heavy rifle from its scabbard. She checked the load, her movements sure and practiced. "The wagon," she said, her breathing heavy, "but even if we stop the wagon, we stop them all." She peered over the top of the boulder. The wagon was 100 yards away, bouncing along the rocky rim, trying to get ahead of them. She rested the rifle barrel on the rock to steady her aim. Jack saw her take a long, slow breath, just as he had taught her. She let half of it out. Her face was a mask of pure concentration. He saw her finger tighten on the trigger. The Winchester roared, the sound magnified by the canyon walls. It was not the panicked shot of a frightened victim. It was the deliberate, calculated shot of a survivor. She hadn't aimed at the driver. She hadn't aimed at the horses. The bullet, true and straight, slammed into the wooden spokes of the wagon's right front wheel. There was a sharp crack of splintering wood, and the wheel collapsed. The wagon lurched violently, tipping onto its side with a sickening crash of metal and timber. Throwing the driver clear, it slid to a halt in a cloud of dust, its path blocked, the pursuit broken. The men in the arroyo cursed and stopped, their advantage lost. And in that sudden, ringing silence, a new sound emerged, the thunder of a dozen horses, approaching at a gallop. At the mouth of the canyon, silhouetted against the bright sky, a line of riders appeared. They were not townsfolk. They were hard-faced, organized men led by a tall figure with a silver star pinned to his vest, a U.S. Marshal. "Martin Beauregard," the marshal's voice boomed. "Carrying across the canyon, you are under arrest by the authority of the United States government on charges of kidnapping and human trafficking." Beauregard's hired guns froze, staring in disbelief. From behind the rock, Nora watched, her knuckles white on the rifle stock. Jack looked at her, then at the marshal, a dawning understanding on his face. He remembered the letter she had sent, the small, hopeful act of mailing her truth out into the world. He had thought it was a message in a bottle, tossed into an uncaring ocean. He was wrong. It had been a summons. The return to the saloon was a scene of stunning reversal. The U. Marshal and his deputies strode in, their presence an undeniable statement of federal power. A cuffed and sputtering Martin Beauregard was shoved into a chair, his fine suit now covered in dust, his aristocratic composure shattered. Sheriff Doyle, his face the color of wet ash, was disarmed and placed under guard. The marshal walked to the bar and presented a warrant to Judge Ashby. "Your Honor, we were alerted by the Society in Philadelphia. Miss Stevenson's letter provided the final piece of evidence we needed in a long-running investigation into Mr. Beauregard's activities. Her testimony is what brought us here." All eyes in the saloon turned to Nora. She stood tall, the Winchester held loosely at her side. She was not a runaway servant. She was not a thief. She was a witness, a catalyst for justice. Judge Ashby looked down from his high chair, his gaze resting on Nora with a newfound respect. He cleared his throat, his voice ringing with authority. "In light of the intervention of the U.S. Marshal's Service, and in accordance with the 13th Amendment of the Constitution, this court dismisses all claims made by Mr. Martin Beauregard. This court declares that Nora Mae Stevenson is, and always has been, a free woman. Any attempt to interfere with her liberty will be met with the full force of federal law." He looked pointedly at the disgraced Sheriff Doyle. "And this court is opening an immediate investigation into the conduct of the local sheriff's office regarding this matter. A slow, hesitant smattering of applause started in the back of the room, growing until the saloon was filled with the sound. It was the sound of a community correcting its own course, of a hard truth finally winning out over an easy lie. Jack stood beside Nora, not touching her, but his presence was a solid wall of support. He looked at her, at the quiet strength that had faced down a tyrant, stared down the barrel of a gun, and bent the arc of the law toward justice. And he knew, with a certainty that filled his entire being, that he was standing next to the strongest person he had ever met. The ride back to the ranch was the quietest journey Jack and Nora had ever taken together. It was a silence unlike any they had known before, not the tense, watchful silence of their early days, nor the companionable, working silence of recent months. This was a quiet of profound, bone-deep relief, the kind that comes after a long fever has broken. The wind that swept across the valley seemed to carry away the last vestiges of fear, leaving behind only the clean, sharp scent of pine and dust and the vast, open sky. As they rode through the main street of Esperanza, they were met with a strange new deference. The men who had gathered to watch the spectacle now looked away, not with suspicion, but with a kind of shame-faced respect. Mrs. Gable stood on the porch of her general store and gave Nora a firm, deliberate nod. The blacksmith, wiping his hands on his leather apron, met Jack's eye and tipped his head in a gesture of solidarity. No one spoke, but the message was clear. They had witnessed not the unmasking of a thief, but the stand of a courageous woman and the unwavering loyalty of the man beside her. The town's collective soul was recalibrating itself around this new, undeniable truth. The days that followed were a period of gentle healing. The U.S. Marshal and his deputies remained for a week, conducting their investigation. Sheriff Doyle was formally removed from his post, and Martin Beauregard, along with his hired guns, was taken south in chains to face federal justice. The legal storm had passed, leaving a stillness in its wake. The apologies, when they came, were as clumsy and heartfelt as the people who offered them. Sarah Joseph, her eyes shining with unshed tears, embraced Nora fiercely, whispering, We knew you were a good soul." Mr. Henderson, the blacksmith whose son attended Nora's barn school, pressed a set of finely wrought iron hooks into Jack's hands. "For your missus," he said gruffly, refusing any payment. For the school, it was an acknowledgement, a peace offering. Others simply offered respect in the form of silence, no longer whispering when Nora passed, but meeting her gaze directly, a quiet admission of their own misjudgment. About a month after the hearing, on a day when the sky was a piercing, cloudless blue, Jack asked Nora to ride with him. He didn't say where they were going. He led her up a steep, winding trail he had shown her once before, a path that led to a high, flat-topped mesa that overlooked the entire San Luis Valley. From up here, the Calloway Ranch was a small, neat patch of order in the vast, wild landscape. The whole world seemed to spread out at their feet. They dismounted and stood at the edge of the rock ledge, the wind gently tugging at Nora's hair. Reverend Amos Pierce was waiting for them, a worn Bible in his hands. He smiled, his eyes kind. Jack turned to Nora. He had no ring of gold or silver to offer her. He held out his hand, and in his palm lay a small, braided loop of dark leather. He had spent the previous evening carefully cutting a thin, supple strip from an old set of his father's reins that had guided a horse through storms and droughts, that were softened with use and strengthened by time. He had braided it into a simple, perfect circle. It was not a symbol of wealth or status. It was a promise of partnership, of shared burdens, of a bond that was meant to be durable, not decorative. "Nora Mae Stevenson," he said, his voice husky, roughened by the wind and emotion. "I placed an advertisement for a wife, a partner. I had no right to expect the woman who answered would be the strongest, bravest person I've ever known. He looked out over the valley, his valley, which now felt like hers. 2. I can't offer you an easy life. This land doesn't allow for it. But I can offer you my name, my home, and my heart. I can promise to stand by you, to be your fortress and your friend. I promise to honor the woman you are, whole and complete. Nora's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were quiet tears of profound joy. She thought of the journey that had brought her to this precipice, the darkness, the fear, the flight. She had come to Colorado seeking sanctuary and had found something far more precious, a home for her soul. "Jack Calloway," she answered, her voice clear and steady in the high, clean air. "I came here with nothing but the clothes on my back and a past I was desperate to outrun. You gave me a roof over my head. You gave me space to heal. You saw the wounds I hid, and instead of prying them open, you covered them with your own coat. You sat vigil with me in the dark. You never tried to own me. You only ever wanted me to be free." She held out her left hand. "I will share your name and your home, and I will be your partner in all the hardships and all the quiet blessings this land has to offer." Jack slid the leather ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Under the vast Colorado sky, with the Reverend's gentle words washing over them. They were married. There was no crowd, no celebration, only the quiet witness of the mountains and a bond forged not of convenience, but of deep, abiding respect and a hard-won love. Returning to the ranch, Nora found her purpose solidifying. The makeshift school in the barn had been a temporary measure, a quiet act of rebellion. Now, it would become something more. She cleared the front porch of the house, scrubbing the wooden planks until they shone. Jack built her a long, sturdy bench and a large blackboard from a smoothed and painted slab of pine. The schoolhouse of the Calloway Ranch was officially open. Her students returned, their numbers swelling slightly as word of their teacher's quiet victory spread. The Ute children, the Joseph girls, the blacksmith's son, and now 2 more children from a neighboring ranch whose parents were eager for them to learn from the woman who had faced down Martin Beauregard. Her supplies were meager: the new blackboard, lumps of charcoal, a tattered copy of the King James Bible that served as a reader, and an old, dog-eared book of Shakespeare's plays that Jack had found packed away in a trunk, a relic from his mother. From these humble tools, Nora spun a world of wonders. She taught the children not just to read words, but to love them. She showed them how the 26 letters of the alphabet could be arranged to tell stories of kings and queens, of shepherds and floods, of their own names and their own lives. The greatest triumphs were the small, quiet ones. The day young Samuel Joseph, his small face screwed up in concentration, finally sounded out his own full name from the slate. The afternoon the shy Skylance girl, Little Fawn, read a whole verse from the Psalms aloud, her voice growing stronger with each word. One sun-drenched afternoon, as the children were packing up to leave, Nora stood leaning against a porch post, watching them go. A genuine, unburdened smile lit up her face, reaching her eyes and making them shine. Jack, watching from the barn, felt his heart ache with a quiet joy. It was the first time he had ever seen her smile without a shadow of the past lurking in its corners. It was the smile of a woman who was not just surviving, but truly living. That night, a profound stillness settled over the ranch. The wind was quiet, the air cool and calm. The children's lessons were done. The animals were settled in the barn, and the day's work was finished. Inside the small house, the only light came from a single oil lamp on the main table, casting a warm, golden glow on the rough-hewn walls. They sat in their usual chairs by the hearth, though the fire was not lit, for a long time. They said nothing, simply sharing the peaceful silence. Jack looked at Nora, her face softened by the lamplight, and the protective tenderness he felt for her was so immense it was a physical presence in the room. "Are you happy, Nora?" he asked, his voice a low whisper, not wanting to break the spell of the evening. She looked up at him, her ash-blue eyes clear and deep. "I don't think I knew what that word meant before," she said, her voice just as quiet. "I knew what it was to be safe, to be relieved. But this, listening to the children read, working beside you, knowing the door is barred against the world not because I'm a prisoner, but because this is our home. Yes, Jack, I am happy." He stood and walked over to her, kneeling on the floor in front of her chair so they were at eye level. He reached out, not to kiss her, but for something more intimate. He rested his forehead against hers. They stayed that way for a long moment, breathing the same air, their worlds contained in that small, warm space between them. "I'm still afraid sometimes," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "In the deep of the night, I hear a floorboard creak, and the old fear comes back. I think he's found me." "He'll never find you again," Jack whispered back, his voice a fierce, protective promise. "And if he sends ghosts, we'll fight them together." He drew back slightly, and his gaze fell to her shoulders. He thought of the scars that lay hidden beneath her dress, the map of her survival. Gently, reverently, he reached out and placed his hand on her back, his large, warm palm resting over the place where he imagined the wounds were deepest. It was not a lover's caress, but a gesture of pure solace, a silent promise to shield and protect, to cover the pain with his own strength. He felt her tense beneath his hand, a lifetime of conditioning making her recoil from an unexpected touch. He did not move, did not press, simply letting his hand rest there, an offering without demand. He was giving her the choice, the power. He would wait. After a long, silent moment, he felt the tension in her shoulders slowly melt away. She leaned into his touch, a movement so slight it was almost imperceptible. She closed her eyes, and with a small, serene nod, she gave him her trust. It was a complete and voluntary surrender, not to him, but to the safety he offered, to the love that had been so patiently built on a foundation of respect. In the quiet glow of the lamplight, with his hand resting protectively on her back, they had finally closed the last distance between them. The intimacy they found in that moment was not about passion or desire, but something far more profound. It was a victory. It was the quiet, triumphant healing of a soul, a testament to a love that had been earned not through possession, but through the patient, unwavering gift of freedom. 1 year later, spring returned to the San Luis Valley not as a battle, but as a blessing. The grass, watered by the gentle thaw of a mild winter, grew thick and green, covering the fire-scorched earth with a blanket of vibrant life. The wind, which had once been a harbinger of hardship, now carried the sweet, loamy scent of the turning soil. At the Callaway Ranch, the sound of children's laughter was as regular as the lowing of the cattle, a testament to the new and gentle order of things. The ranch itself, once on the brink of failure, was thriving under the steady, partnered work of its 2 inhabitants. It was a place of peace, a small, stubborn pocket of hope carved out of the vast, indifferent wilderness. On a bright morning in early May, Nora walked alone up the gentle slope of the hill behind the house. The wildflowers were in full bloom: blue lupine, Indian paintbrush, and sunny dandelions, and she gathered a small, simple bouquet as she went. Her destination was a small, fenced-in plot of land marked by a simple wooden cross. It was the grave of Martha Callaway. In the early days, Nora had avoided this place. It had felt like an intrusion, a reminder that she was a replacement, a practical solution to a problem born of grief. But that feeling had long since faded, replaced by a quiet sense of gratitude and connection. She knew Martha not as a rival or a ghost, but through the man she had loved. She saw her in the sturdy construction of the house, in the well-worn quilts folded in the linen press, and in the deep well of kindness and patience that lay at the core of Jack's quiet nature. She knelt in the soft grass beside the grave, the leather ring on her finger warm from the sun. She cleared away a few stray weeds and gently laid the wildflowers at the base of the cross. She did not pray with words, but with a quiet offering of her heart. "Thank you," she thought, the sentiment directed at the woman who rested beneath the earth. "Thank you for the home you built, for the man you loved. I will take care of him. I will take care of this life." It was not an act of supplanting a memory, but of joining it, of weaving her own story into the continuing history of this land and this family. She was making peace not only with Jack's past, but with the very idea that a life and a love could come before hers without diminishing the one she now had. As she stood, looking out over the ranch, she saw the familiar figure of Reverend Amos Pierce riding up the lane on his mule. He was a welcome sight, a symbol of the community's conscience and a bringer of news from the wider world. By the time Nora walked back down the hill, Jack had already met him on the porch, a pot of coffee steaming between them. "Nora," the Reverend said, his face breaking into a warm smile as she approached, "you are looking well. The valley agrees with you." "It's a good morning, Reverend," she smiled, taking a seat. The ease between the three of them was a comfortable, familiar thing. After they had spoken of the weather, the price of cattle, and the progress of Nora's students, the Reverend reached into his satchel. "I have a letter for you," he said, his tone more serious. "Not from the mail route. This was given to me by a man on the southbound stage, with instructions to deliver it to you personally. It comes from Philadelphia." He handed Nora a thick, crisp envelope. The return address was that of the Quaker Society. Her heart gave a small, sudden leap. It had been almost a year since she had sent her testimony out into the world. This was the echo. Her hands were steady as she broke the seal. Jack watched her, his expression calm and supportive, his hand resting on the porch rail near her chair. She unfolded the pages, the paper covered in the same kind of neat, elegant script she herself used. She read in silence, the words on the page painting a picture of a justice she had never truly believed she would see. The letter, from a man named Isaac Thorne, detailed the full conclusion of the case against Martin Beauregard. Her testimony, he wrote, had been the key that unlocked everything. It had corroborated the whispered stories of other women and given the federal marshals the legal grounds to dismantle his entire network. Beauregard had been tried and convicted not just for kidnapping, but under newly strengthened federal statutes against human trafficking. His wealth and influence had not saved him. He would spend the remainder of his life in a federal penitentiary. But it was the next paragraph that made Nora's breath catch in her throat. The letter went on to say that as a result of the investigation, 7 other women had been found and liberated from similar situations of bondage in and around New Orleans. The Society, with the funds and information provided by the federal case, was now working to provide them with safe passage, housing, and the means to start new lives. "They are free," Nora whispered, looking up at Jack, her eyes shining with a light he had never seen before. "Jack, the others, they're free!" She handed him the letter. He read it, his brow furrowed, his expression slowly changing from grim satisfaction to a kind of profound awe. He looked at his wife, at the small, quiet woman who had arrived on his doorstep cloaked in fear, and saw the truth of what she had accomplished. Her single act of courage, of writing a letter in a lonely room by candlelight, had sent out ripples of hope that had become a tidal wave of liberation 1,000 miles away. The last ghost of Martin Beauregard had finally been laid to rest, not just for her, but for women she would never even meet. That evening, as the last of the sun's rays painted the Sangre de Cristo peaks in shades of rose and violet, Nora and Jack walked hand in hand down to the creek. The water ran clear and cool over the smooth river stones, its gentle burble the only sound in the peaceful twilight. Nora stopped and turned to him. She took his large, work-roughened hand and placed it gently on her stomach. The fabric of her dress was soft beneath his palm. He looked at her, his expression questioning, and she smiled that new, unshadowed smile of hers. "There is more news." "Jack," she said softly. "News the letter did not bring." He felt it then, a faint, delicate flutter beneath his hand, as soft as a moth's wing. It was the barest whisper of a new life, a secret heartbeat that had been kept between her and the universe until this very moment. Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by a wave of pure, unadulterated joy that seemed to light him from within. He knelt before her in the cool grass, his ear pressed to where his hand had been, as if he could hear the future. "If it's a girl," Nora said, her voice thick with emotion as she ran her fingers through his hair, "I want to name her Hope." The name was perfect. It was a summary of their entire story, a testament to the future they had built from the ashes of their pasts. Jack looked up at her, his face full of a love so deep and powerful it was humbled by its own existence. He smiled, a wide, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Whoever it is," he said, his voice full of a quiet, unshakable conviction, "they'll be born in freedom." He stood and drew her into his arms, holding her as the first stars began to prick the deep velvet of the sky. He held the two people who were his entire world, the woman who had taught him the meaning of courage, and the child who was the embodiment of their new beginning. From the high, silent vantage of the mesa where they had been married, the Calloway Ranch was a small, unassuming square of light and order against the vast, dark canvas of the valley. It looked no different from any of the other small homesteads dotting the plains, but it was a universe unto itself. Seen from a distance, it was tiny, vulnerable, no bigger than a life raft in a great, dark sea. But for those within its fences, it was everything. It was a sanctuary, a schoolhouse, a fortress, a home. It was the place where a cowboy had seen the wounds a woman hid and, instead of running, had offered her his name and his heart. It was a small patch of earth where the deepest scars had finally found a safe place to heal. Thank you for listening to this story. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from, so we can connect and share our thoughts. Be sure to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Night, like this video, and give it an extra boost by hitting the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.